Assalamualaikum, and you're watching South Asia TV. My name is Mubashir Luqman, and today we have some very important issues to discuss. And I have with me a very renowned person, Michael Kugelman, who's the Deputy Director, Asia Program for South Asia, Senior Associate, the Wilson Center. And he covers basically Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and Bangladesh. Mr. Kugelman, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And before we begin, I would like to ask you a very simple question that pertains to Pakistan politics, since you have a very close eye on the region. How do you see the recent APC, the All Parties Conference, and the fallout of that? Who do you think is the real winner of that APC?
Well, I think that we knew that this APC conference was coming for a while. It sort of follows on the brief protest movement that happened in November of last year. I don't think we should overstate the impact of it. At first impression is that Nawaz Sharif made a very strong, harsh speech against the military, and yet it seemed to be undercut by the fact that there were revelations that the establishment was having these secret meetings with the opposition, perhaps to work out deals. And the messaging from PMLN leaders seemed to suggest a degree of tension within the party. But the interesting thing to me is that in recent days, this very strong criticism of the army has been put out there publicly in a big way, and you have many powerful people across the political spectrum that are calling out the establishment, and that does risk putting the establishment on the defensive. At any rate, in terms of what could be coming, it's hard to say. My sense is that it's highly unlikely that we could see any type of broad anti-government protest movement. To me, the opposition seems too divided for that to happen. But the question is, what could be the implications for the establishment? Could there be divisions that could be seeded, given that there's all this criticism and pushback against the establishment from the opposition? So that remains to be seen. But I do think that I've observed Pakistani politics for a number of years. There's a lot of noise. You get a lot of noise all the time. But at the end, do things really change all that much? Not necessarily. And for those that suggest that we could be seeing a redux of the 2007-2008 movement against the government, to me that seems but very hard to believe. So I imagine that this will eventually wind down. But bottom line is that I think it is significant that the establishment is getting criticized so heavily in public by so many different components of the political spectrum on the opposition.
Right. Anyway, now we have a serious conflict brewing up in Southeast Asia, especially China and India. You sitting in Washington and having a bird's eye view. How do you see this conflict, sort of growing from here?
Well, it's serious. I mean, you've had many border disputes, border crises between India and China since the war that the two fought in the 1960s, which did not resolve their border dispute. This one worries me a lot more than others have, just because it's been so much longer, it's been so much tenser, and more violent and deadly than these border crises typically are. I think that both sides are digging in or hunkering down. Neither side has an incentive to back down anytime soon. You have very nationalistic governments in both China and India that don't want to be the one to make the first move. I think that China certainly was, its thinking and its moves have been impacted by a number of factors. One of them certainly being India's revocation of Article 370. In August of 2019, China had been opposed to that from the start, from the day it happened. I think China also knows that its relationship with the U.S. is free-falling, and it also sees the U.S.-India relationship improving and really growing in a big way. So I think that for China, the idea is to try to keep sending tough messages to both Washington and New Delhi by pushing back hard on the border. And India, I think, is under a lot of pressure. The Modi government is under a lot of pressure from its public, given that 20 Indian soldiers died in a deadly exchange back in June. And I think that it's in a tough spot. It's the weaker power relative to China. There's only so much it could do, but it doesn't want to back down. So, here in Washington, I think the view is clearly a hope that it will wind down eventually. I think we could assume that the U.S. government has provided some intelligence support to India to help it better track the location and movement of Chinese troops. The U.S. is not going to get involved any other way. I don't think India would want it to. But bottom line is that the weather is going to soon get worse in Ladakh. And in the past, you would assume that each side would figure out a way to wind things down because it's hard to maintain these positions in the bad weather. And yet this time around, I think that we could have both sides hunkering down for the long haul, even when the weather starts getting bad. So no easy out. I really don't see this crisis winding down anytime soon.
Now, tell me one thing, from what I understand from my Chinese sources, that India wanted to give away the air base of Ladakh to the Americans. And Chinese are very, very jittery about that because they thought that would jeopardize their Belt and Road project totally, especially the CPAC project. And hence they retaliated, and they retaliated big time, and they're not going to stop over there. How do you answer that?
Well, that's a good question. I have not heard about that. I really don't know. I would not overstate the role that the U.S. plays in this, other than, as I said before, providing intelligence support to New Delhi, and certainly China's thinking is impacted by its understanding that its relationship with the U.S. is really struggling, while the U.S.-India relationship has really gotten a lot of momentum, in great part because of shared concern about China. But I can't really address that.
But do you realize that India being a nuclear power, Pakistan a nuclear power, China a nuclear power, and then Russia and Israel close by nuclear powers, and suddenly if things heat up, America is the one that's really fueling the fire by providing so much of arms and ammunition and the warplanes to India. Do you not think that they are trying to create an imbalance of the region, and this is not good? It's very detrimental.
Well, I think it's actually the opposite. I think that the U.S. is trying to provide more balance in the region simply because it justifies its arms sales and its growing security relationship with India on the need to counterbalance Chinese power. I mean, we all know that China is a more militarily powerful country than India is. And I think that in Washington, the concern is that China is throwing its weight around, that it has this wolf warrior diplomacy, which entails more aggressively pursuing its interests and its territorial claims, not just in Ladakh, but in the broader Indo-Pacific region, including the South China Sea. So certainly I could understand that the perspective in China and in Pakistan is that the U.S. risks destabilizing the region by providing more security assistance to India. But the view here is very different. It's the opposite. It's the fact that China is too strong relative to the rest of the region. It poses threats to the interests of the United States and its partners, its treaty allies in Japan and South Korea, and of course its security partner India. So yeah, the perspective is actually very different here in DC.
Okay. Now the perspective over here in Pakistan is, when it comes to UAE and Israel peace, that there's something that you're missing over here. People are very skeptical about it because, and I repeat, because Donald Trump tweeted about it before any of those two countries could come and give their own statement. So it looks a very, very dicey situation over there. Why did POTUS have to do that? Why couldn't he wait for those countries to announce it and then sort of try to come in and take credit?
Well, I mean, I'm sure you would agree that Donald Trump always wants to be able to take credit for everything before anyone does. So, in that sense, it doesn't surprise me. And keeping in mind the domestic political situation in the U.S., we've got an election coming up, and I think that the president is looking for wins to present to the American people, who largely are very supportive of Israel. And I think that he wanted to, be the first one to say, well, look, we've got this big deal, that we helped broker this big deal between Israel and a key player in the Middle East. This is going to bring more economic cooperation. It's going to bring more stability for Israel. So, yeah, I mean, to me, it's a pretty simple matter. Trump, when it comes to diplomatic niceties and the types of protocol that you typically get with a senior U.S. leader, he clearly has jettisoned all that. He doesn't care. He wants to take all the credit all the time.
Now, the one thing that a lot of Muslim countries are unhappy about with this Israel-UAE deal is that it's directly impacting them. Let me give you an example. As of today, my figures are that Egypt has lost trade worth about $4.5 billion because Israelis do not need to use the Suez Canal anymore. to go to certain regions of the Middle East. So more and more countries are being impacted by it, and not all are happy. So do you see this peace deal lasting?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't see this as a deal that would unravel anytime soon. I think that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages from the perspective of both Israel and the UAE. But for me, I think that the big risk is what impact this will be on the very volatile rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iran, of course, is dead set against any of these normalization deals between Israel and the Arab states of the Gulf and the Middle East. And I think that we could see an intensification of that rivalry, which had already been very strong and sharp, particularly given things like the U.S. Decision to assassinate Qasem Soleimani earlier this year and some other things. So the geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East may, on some levels, be stabilized when you have Israel sign this big deal with a longstanding rival. And yet, Iran is very unhappy, is very concerned. Saudi Arabia, of course, is, I think, very supportive of these things. Not that Saudi Arabia is going to normalize relations with Israel anytime soon, but I think it does support this because it sees it as another way to push back against Iran. So that's the thing that I worry about. I don't think that the economic factors of it deal in any way, at least not at this early point.
Mr. Kugelman, let me give you a bit of news. I'm sure you know about it already, but China and Iran are jointly ready to invest in Yemen. And they're also going to go there for oil exploration and probably have a base over there. Should that happen, then it will be nearly impossible for Saudi Arabia to, carry its oil in tankers from there, and they have to take a very, very long route upwards towards the Suez Canal and then onwards. That means that the Saudi hegemony of oil will be finished forever. Do you see a time like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is another reason, going back to my earlier point, that this Saudi Arabia-Iran rivalry is very volatile and could well be heightened by some of these new developments, including this somewhat mysterious deal between China and Iran, which we've heard about that it's coming for quite some time. It's still a bit unclear as to what exactly it would entail. But I do think that it's something that would be very concerning to Saudi Arabia and certainly concerning to the United States. And you look at China and Iran as probably America's biggest two foreign policy concerns right now, along with Russia, perhaps. Um, and I think that it certainly has some very interesting potential implications and perhaps even positive implications for Pakistan. You look at this, what seems to be newfound momentum in the CPEC project, and one wonders if perhaps this new China-Iran deal could be worked in a way that China could start developing the Chabahar port in Iran if India, because of pressure from the U.S., decides to back out of that, and if that could create ways for there to be linkages between Gwadar, part of CPEC, and Chabahar. So that's all very preliminary right now. I don't want to overstate the progress that's been made with developing the Gwadar port. That still needs time. But I could certainly see some potential opportunities for Pakistan and for CPEC emerging from this unfolding China-Iran deal.
Last question. I'm glad for once that I'm not an American, but what a choice to make in this coming election, Biden versus Donald Trump. But still, who do you think is winning?
Well, I for despite everything that's happened with Trump over the last 4 years, until relatively recently, I really thought that it was his election to win, that he was in a good position to win it. But there's been a triple whammy of problems for Trump over the last few months: the pandemic, which he handled incredibly poorly, the social tensions and the racial tensions when you've had these protests following police killings of African Americans, and a significant economic crisis. I think that's a triple whammy. It all really came at the same time, and that has made Trump more vulnerable than he has been at any other time politically over his 4 years as president. And we're only a few weeks away from the election. So I think that Biden, particularly if he doesn't really do much and just lets Trump self-destruct, so to speak, I think that he'd have an advantage. But you know what? We all remember in 2016, Hillary Clinton was widely favored in the polls and by every pundit out there, and we know what happened in the 2016 election.
Actually, we don't know what happened in the 2016 elections, to be honest.
Right.
that election turned out to be between females and emails, and that was a choice the Americans made at that time. But on a closing note, Michael, can I tell you one thing, and this is something personal, nothing to do with politics, that I have been to a lot of mosques, for prayers and all that, and many times I've heard the general public over there pray for the safety of the American people who are facing the COVID-19. People are generally praying for everyone, and we want you and all others to be safe.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And indeed, it's been a very tough time here in the United States. So that support from your countrymen and you is much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kugelman, for joining us. You were hearing and watching Michael Kugelman. Do give us your comments, do give us your questions, just in case if we have them again, we will try to put up those questions to him. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Do not forget to press the bell icon.